chapters 12 and 13 tonight, just to sort of set the stage for getting here. We go back a little bit, and Saul has been anointed king of Israel. The nation is sort of at its peak in terms of its size and its power. The wealth has been pouring in. We've been looking at that over the last few weeks as Solomon takes on the task of building the temple, building his own home, and just overflowing with wealth and the structures that he's building. And I know we've looked at those in detail in the recent weeks. The temple has been built and dedicated. The original kingdom of Israel, we're going to see that as it began under Saul and David, continued under Solomon, is soon going to be divided, northern kingdom, a southern kingdom, and we will see the division is followed by a period of about 200 years of oppression, injustice, moral decline of the people, finally leading to capture. The nation under David and Solomon included all of Palestine. The governing and the protecting of the land required a lot of resources, and in fact, a lot of laborers, a lot of soldiers, a variety of people that were involved in this process, and all of this required more and more resources and more tax money that was put on the people. As we said, Solomon engaged in massive building programs, including the temple and his own palace. And to accomplish that, he engaged in forced labor. If you go back to 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 15, and this is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon drafted to build the house of the Lord in his own house. And then if you drop over to drop down to verse 17, so it tells what Solomon built. And then in verse 22, but of the people of Israel, Solomon made no slaves. They were the soldiers. They were his officials, his commanders, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen. So Solomon engaged in this process from people that he brought to this project. The non-Jews were slaves to do the building, and the Jewish citizens were, as we just read, in different roles within his palace, or within his reign. As you looked at last week with Justin, toward the end of his life here, Solomon turns from the Lord. And in chapter 11 and verse 6, so Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. When Solomon began to reign, God said he would give him whatever he asked for. And what did he ask for? Wisdom. He asked, of all the things he could have asked for, he asked for wisdom. And now we see toward the end of his life, he is described as doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord. Quite a turnaround for Solomon. You also saw last week in chapter 11, Ahijah prophesies that the kingdom is going to be torn apart. Verse 29, and at that time when Jeroboam went out to Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him on the road. Now Ahijah had dressed himself in a new garment, and the two of them were alone in the open country. Then Ahijah laid hold of the new garment that was on him, and he tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I'm about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and will give you 10 tribes. So this prophet tells Jeroboam that the kingdom is getting ready to be split, and you're going to have 10 of the tribes. And then we read at the end of chapter 11, Solomon dies in verse 43. Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. So just so we're not confused, when we look at this account and what we're going to look at tonight, we have Jeroboam, we have Rehoboam. These are not the Boam brothers, Jerry and Ray. These are two different people, different families, just happen to have the names Jeroboam and Rehoboam. The key person in this division of Israel that we're going to see was Solomon's son, Rehoboam. How many wives and concubines did Solomon have? 1,000. He had, was it 700 wives, 300 concubines. Rehoboam is the only heir of Solomon that we read about by name in the text, as far as I can find. You would suspect out of 1,000 wives and concubines, he had a lot of kids. Rehoboam is the only one that is mentioned in Scripture. And as we noted, in chapter 11, it tells us Solomon's turn from the Lord to doing evil. And it just points out to us that ending our lives well, ending well, is extremely important. Dying well is extremely important. It's important all the way through our lives, but if we falter at some point, then it's all been for nothing. And so we see Solomon here at this point, the turn toward evil. And because of that, the kingdom is going to be torn in two. We know from 1 Kings 14, jumping a little bit ahead, Rehoboam is 41 years old as he takes over his reign of the kingdom. So very quickly here, I don't know how well you can see that. The story tonight beginning in chapter 12 that we'll jump to in just a moment, we see here the two kingdoms. You see Jerusalem there, and a lot of this takes place at Shechem. As we'll see in verse 1 of chapter 12, Shechem plays a big role in the story tonight. Shechem was a place of great historical significance to Israel. In Genesis 12, Abram arrives at Shechem after he leaves his home and he builds an altar there. In Genesis 33, Jacob stays there after he wrestles with God and has his meeting with Esau. Joshua 24, Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel there, and in fact, it says Joshua was buried there in 24 and verse 32. So let's read the first 3 verses here of chapter 12. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. So remember, Solomon's died. Rehoboam is going to take over. He goes to Shechem because Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. And as soon as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, we'll stop there for just a second. So remember, back in chapter 11, Jeroboam's on the scene. He is, in verse 28 of chapter 11, Jeroboam was able, when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of so Jeroboam was a big man in Solomon's entourage there. And just like his grandfather before him, Saul, Solomon eventually decides he wants to kill Jeroboam. And so Jeroboam flees to Egypt. So now Rehoboam has gone to Shechem. Israel is going to make him king. Jeroboam hears about that, and he returns from Egypt to Shechem. I don't know, the text doesn't tell us why they chose Shechem, why Rehoboam went to Shechem to be made king. Maybe it was an attempt on his part to, kind of rally the people that, bring the two groups of people together, the ones in Jerusalem and Shechem. I don't know that. What we do know, the people are asking for relief. So we've already talked about this. Solomon's kingdom is rich, prosperous, thriving, but there's growing discontent. Just talked about that. Jeroboam's been in Egypt. The people summon him back when Rehoboam is about to be made king. Look in verse 4. The people here, they sent and called him, Jeroboam, and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. And he said to them, go away for 3 days, then come again to me. So the people went away. So the people call for Rehoboam to lighten the burden that his father Solomon had put on them. And he says, if you will lighten the service, what do they say they'll do? We'll serve you. If you'll lighten the load on us, this burden that you have put on, that your father put on us, if you'll lighten that load, we will serve you. I don't know at this point if Rehoboam knows that the kingdom is going to be split. The text doesn't tell us whether he is aware of that or not. But maybe his agreeing to go to Shechem was his way of trying to keep that from happening. I don't know. That's just a guess. But it is interesting to me, as we looked at in chapter 11, Solomon had gone into idolatry, right? Talks about all the things that Solomon did. His heart had turned away from God. He had gone into idolatry. And out of all this, what did the people request from Rehoboam? Just lighten our load. They're not objecting to the idolatry. They don't bring that up and say, look what your father was doing. We don't want to do that. They just said, lighten our load a little bit. And we will serve you. Rehoboam responds to that in verse 5, go away for 3 days, then come again. So the people went away. So he responds and says, come back in 3 days, and I'll give you an answer. He consulted, in verse 6, then King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men who stood before Solomon, his father, while he was yet alive, saying, how do you advise me to answer this people? So Rehoboam says, give me 3 days, and then he goes and talks to the older people here. So a couple of principles that I'd like to consider at this point. First thing is, there is often value in taking time to make decisions. I don't know why Rehoboam asked for 3 days. I don't know what precipitated him to tell them that. But there is value at times in taking time to make decisions. It's not always possible. Sometimes you have to make a decision. But there is value in doing that. We've already studied back in 1 Samuel chapter 13 when Saul was waiting for Samuel to come and make the sacrifice, and Samuel didn't show up. And instead of waiting, Saul made the decision to go ahead and do it himself, a decision that he was condemned for. One of my favorite ones in Nehemiah chapter 2, when Nehemiah goes back to build the wall, he goes out at night by himself and inspects what have I got to do here, thinking about what the plan, what needed to happen. He went out by himself in the night to think about that decision. So sometimes taking time to make a decision is very, very important. So the first place that Rehoboam goes to discuss this decision is to who? The older men. The older men. So there is value in seeking wise counsel before making difficult decisions. Seeking those that are wise, those that are experienced, is often helpful. I've got several passages there in Proverbs. I'm not going to take the time to read them all, because it's just Proverbs is filled with that. Doesn't mean that we automatically discount the advice of our peers, those that are close to us, but we should seek out those that have experience and wisdom when making difficult decisions, and not just making snap judgments, or not just going to somebody that's going to tell us what we want to hear, and that's ultimately what Rehoboam does. This next one that I thought about, this is probably my favorite one of all. Don't discount the counsel of old people just because they're old. When we're young, when we're 16, 18, 20, 30, 40, sometimes we just discount what the old people tell us because they're just old. They don't understand. And we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't discount. I mean, I go to David a lot for, counsel. And it is a sobering thought and a great consequence to young people that are setting out in the world, and we've got some college students that just left, to think about who they are going to associate with and who they're going to depend on for advice and counsel. That's for parents, that's a scary thought, and it's a sobering thought, and it's why we should have this concept and this principle. Are they going to depend on those that just feed their ego, their pride, their vanity, just to tell them what they want to hear? Or are they going to consult with people that give them what they want? Rehoboam ends up doing what a lot of people do, and us included at times. You shop for advice. You shop for advice. You go to this person. They don't tell you what you like or want to hear, so I'll go to this person. And I'll keep going. It's like, when your kids are little and, mom tells you no, then what do? You go to dad because he's going to tell you yes, whatever it is. Or big daddy, and he's going to always tell you yes. So, but that's important. The next thing I think about in terms of this, especially with Rehoboam, Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived. And then we look at Rehoboam, and we understand wisdom is not inherited. Wisdom nor grace runs in the blood. And wisdom doesn't always go by age or by years or by education. That's not a given in it. I do want to turn over to Proverbs chapter 1. Turn over there for just a second. Proverbs chapter 1. You're all familiar with this. Is in Proverbs 1 and verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And then turn over to chapter 2. My son, verse 1, my son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding, yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He shores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of his saints. If you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord. Instilling these principles in our kids and in our grandkids of developing the knowledge of God, so that from that they can gain wisdom and insight. So what do the old men tell Rehoboam? What's their response? Pardon? Lighten the load. So the older men respond. They say in verse 7, they said to him, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. He says, be a servant leader. You serve them. You be a servant to them. You speak good words to the people, and they will serve you forever. What tremendous advice from these wise old men that had sat at the feet of Solomon, the wisest man ever. And they tell Rehoboam, this is what you should do. You serve these people. You be a servant leader to them. You speak good words to them, and they will serve you forever. Wow, what a powerful response from these older men. I'm just full of life principles tonight, so we're going to get a lot of them. So the next one I thought about, leaders carry with them a heavy burden. So as Rehoboam is about to lead his people, or attempt to, he's right out of the gate, he's got this very difficult decision to make. How am I going to respond to these people who are begging me to reduce their load? Leaders carry a heavy burden, a heavy responsibility. It's a challenge to make wise decisions based on what people need. And that starts with our family. As the leader of our family, it sometimes is challenging to make the right decision based on what our family needs, not necessarily what they want. I talked a few weeks ago when I preached, and I talked about the guy that I worked for about 20 years. One of the fundamental things he taught me, when we'd go into hospitals and we'd talk to people about our system and all that, and they would sit back and they'd have a list. These are the things I want. And he would sit there and ask question after question, and he told me, he said, we have to find out what they really need, not what they want, because oftentimes they don't know what they want. Whether it's your family, and that's where it starts, whether it's in the church, whether it's a business, whatever it is, leaders have a challenge in making those types of decisions, and that's where Rehoboam is right out of the gate. Decisions made by leaders may not always satisfy the people, may not be what they want. We have to determine what they need. Jesus was repeatedly teaching his disciples about being servants. John chapter 13, this is where Jesus is washing his disciples' feet. And he's teaching them the lesson about being a servant as a leader. Luke chapter 22, the disciples never figured that out, because what were they always arguing about? Who's the great? Who's going to be number one? I want to be number one. And Jesus finally told Peter, you don't know what you're talking about. We've been studying this in our class at the Reserve. In Luke chapter 23, when Pilate is questioning and trying Jesus, what decision does Pilate make about Jesus? What's his determination about Jesus? He's innocent. He hasn't done anything. But because of the people, he listened to the people, and he chose to release the murderer instead. Leaders carry a heavy burden of doing what's right in sometimes difficult circumstances. So Rehoboam rejects the older men's counsel. In verse 8, but he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him and took counsel with young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. He abandoned, ESV, some translations I think say rejected. ESV says he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him. Why did he abandon? The text doesn't tell us. Why would he abandon the counsel of these old men? What would be the reason he would reject that when they say, be a servant to them, do what they're asking? Why would he turn that down? Pride. First of all, in essence, they're criticizing his father. They're criticizing his father for, this heavy burden that they'd given to him. Because of that burden, how did Solomon live? Lavishly. So consequently, his son is going to live. So if he lightens the load, then that might impact his lifestyle. Along with his, sound familiar? Does it sound familiar? And maybe he only turned to these older men because just out of courtesy. Maybe never. The scripture doesn't tell us. We don't know for sure. But those are some possibilities, certainly. So he turns to the young men for counsel. He took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. What's their response? Drop the hammer. He asked them, what do you advise me? Lighten the load that your father put on. And the young man who had grown up with him said, thus you shall speak to this people. Your father made our yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. That's always been a strange saying to me. First of all, they acknowledge that Solomon had put a great burden, a heavy burden on the people, but then they appeal to Rehoboam's vanity and his pride. And they said, you tell them that your weakest actions are going to be more severe than anything your father had ever done. Your little finger is thicker than your father's thighs. And they tell him to warn them that the discipline would be much more severe than his father's. And he says in verse 11, and now whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. What's a scorpion? Stings. Scorpion was another name for the kinds of whips that had metal pieces or bone or something at the end of it. So kind of like what we see Jesus being scourged with. So he says, you tell them, look, Solomon used whips on you. We're going to use something far worse than that. So that's the response from the young people. What is absent in this text about Rehoboam's seeking guidance here? Yeah, it doesn't tell us. We can assume that does not happen. I don't know. Maybe he did. But that leads us to another principle. Leaders, as well as everyone, should seek God's wisdom through prayer. God never discourages us from coming to him for help. Jeremiah 33 and verse 3, call to me and I will answer you and will tell you great and hidden things that you have not known. Luke chapter 22, Jesus before his arrest is going into the garden and praying to his Father. So many passages, I won't read Philippians 4 or James 1, all talking about seeking God's help and his wisdom. The text doesn't tell us, but there is no evidence here that Rehoboam asked God, what should I do here? The next thing I would think about, we've talked about the old men, but also the fact that being young does not exempt someone from making good choices and making good decisions. Just because I'm young doesn't mean that I get a free pass on just making dumb choices. We all have done it, but it doesn't excuse that. Genesis 39:12 was Joseph. When Joseph is being hounded by Potiphar's wife, what does he finally do? He runs. He made the decision, I'm just getting out of here. I'm getting out of here. Paul told Timothy, let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech and conduct, in love and faith and purity. Rehoboam was choosing, and his friends were giving him this advice of using slogans over servitude. You know, those whips versus scorpions. We got this slogan going, this is what we're going to do, versus what he should have been doing in listening to the conduct of the old men. Rehoboam makes his choice. He makes his choice. He listens to his advice from his young friends. He would make the conditions of the people even worse. In verse 13, the king answered the people harshly. So as he responds to the people, it even describes his response and says he answered the people harshly and forsaking the counsel that the old men had given him. And his harsh answer served only to just fan the flames. They were already upset. They were discontented. They were seeking his help. And he just double downs and says, I'm dropping the hammer. And whatever their hope there might have been for further unity is gone at this point as he responds to them. We drop on down a little bit into verse, let's go to verse 15 of chapter 12. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord spoke to Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. We'll get to that in just a second. Verse 16, when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel, look now to your own house, David. So Israel went to their tents. But Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. So Rehoboam does not listen to the people, and we're told here that this was God's will being done here. God was working behind the scenes. Because of Rehoboam's response, it says the turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word. The prophecy that had been made that we talked about in chapter 11 is being fulfilled now because the kingdom is going to be decided. And only Judah would remain for Solomon's heir to rule over, for Rehoboam to have in his kingdom. So Rehoboam's choice now has tragic consequences. The nation is split. There's hostilities between the north and the south for many years to come. Look in verse 18. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was taskmaster over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. So, adding insult to injury here, Rehoboam makes a stupid decision with the people. They are starting to revolt. It's like you're revolting against the taxes that are being levied on you, and so my decision is to send the head IRS agent out to talk to you. That did not go over well. And the people stoned him. They looked at him and said, you're the reason this is all happening. He was the head guy. He was the taskmaster over the forced labor. And they stoned him to death. That was Rehoboam's choice. Rehoboam was left with the southern kingdom of Judah. We read over in chapter 14 that his reign overall was evil. The people fell into idolatry. They set up images. And now Jeroboam is going to be the king of the north. And Jeroboam, we'll see in a moment, he is insisting on setting up a rival religion in order to keep his people away from Jerusalem. In Rehoboam wants to send an army to the north, and God stops him from doing that. And in verse 24, thus says the Lord, you shall not go up and fight against your relatives, the people of Israel. Every man return to his home, for this thing is from me. So they listened to the word of the Lord and went home again according to the word of the Lord. Then Jeroboam built in Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifice in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So Jeroboam sets up 2 calves for worship, one in Bethel and one in Dan. And he tells them, hey, here's your gods now. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. If you turn back to Exodus chapter 32, we won't go there. Oh, we're almost done. But this is the exact quote from Aaron when he built the golden calf. The exact quote that is used in Exodus chapter 32. And this is what Jeroboam is now doing. So, understanding our choices have consequences. Rehoboam made a choice here, and his choice had tragic consequences. We have to evaluate the cost of our choices. Proverbs 11 and verse 14, where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors, there is safety. All right, we're going to move real quickly because I got to cover chapter 13. Chapter 13 begins, a man of God comes, confronts Jeroboam. Jeroboam does the one thing that is certain to destroy his kingdom. He turns his people from following God and turns to idolatry. He sets up the 2 golden calves. We read that he established his own priests. Where were the priests supposed to come from? Tribe of Levi. He sets up his own priests. He appoints priests from every tribe. He appoints himself as high priest. He established his own festivals. In, let's see if I can find where that one is. That's back over in verse 32, chapter 12, 30. Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah. The feast that was in Judah was a month before that. And so Jeroboam is setting up his own feast, his own festival. He persuaded the people to disobey God by not going to Jerusalem to worship. First thing he did is he says, I'm going to make this very convenient for you all. We're going to make worship convenient. Does that sound familiar? You don't want to come worship on Sunday mornings? Okay, great. We'll worship on Saturday nights. We're going to make worship, and that's what Jeroboam is doing. He doesn't want his people going to Jerusalem because he's afraid if they go to Jerusalem, what's going to happen? They'll stay there. Their allegiance will go back to Rehoboam. He won't be in power anymore. They will try to kill him. So he is making worship convenient for them. His worship was not based on obedience. It was based on convenience. He began this process of inclusivity, right? The priests are supposed to come from the tribe of Levi. And Jeroboam says, well, we'll just let everybody be priests. You're not the tribe of Levi? That's okay. Everybody can be a priest. Let's include everybody. We accept everyone. It doesn't matter. And then he created his own festivals. This was full throttle idolatry. Look in chapter 12 and verse 33. Chapter 12, verse 33. He went up to the altar that he made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, in the month that he had devised from his, where? From his own heart. From his own heart. Go back over to verse 26 of chapter 12. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back. He was looking inwardly. He was looking inwardly here. He looked outwardly because he consulted with others. He never looked up. He was sincere in what he was doing. I assume he was sincere, but yet he was wrong. He was wrong. And he was leading his people into idolatry, full-blown idolatry. We read in 2 Chronicles chapter 11 that many of the priests and the Levites fled to Jerusalem because of Jeroboam's wickedness. They were getting out of there. Jeroboam practiced the philosophy of whatever works is right. For him, he wanted to do what was going to work for him. And that was, I need to keep my people up here. I'll set up my own altars, my own places of worship. You don't have to go down. That's a long way to Jerusalem. You don't have to go there. We'll just stay up here. Everybody can be a priest. That sounds really good. We all want to be priests. That's good. And in order to protect his own power, he created his own religion. And so we've got to be careful not to do the same thing. He's sitting there thinking, God raised me up. God established me over this kingdom. Certainly, God doesn't want all my people going down there and leaving me up here to get the stop sign and say it's time to quit. I got two more. I got one more life. Don't discount the old ways just because they are old, as long as they are God's ways. Hosea said, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge because you have rejected knowledge. I reject you from being a priest, and since you have forgotten the law of your God, I will forget your children. Thank you. I didn't quite make it, but I got pretty close. Not really, but thank you.